He pulled into a space between two other cars of possible campers and parked. There were no posted signs of parking hours or regulations, not even one about the owner assuming their own risk and liability. He was surprised but pleased with how easy that part was going. He hadn't even considered hiding the car until he was in the forest. He had just been planning to hide himself. He had forgotten the important detail of a rather cumbersome automobile, but Lady Luck seemed to be on his side. He hoped she would stay there for a while longer. If not, he would still be the victor. When he turned off the engine, the feeling hit him. That was it. The end of a substantial part of the journey. It was a critical part that he had to survive before he could go on to the next step. Meeting the cantankerous author had been a large step. Gathering the information and ingredients had been yet another. But the next one was riskier in so many ways. He told himself that he couldn't wait to see what things were like when he got back inside the car again. So much would have happened by then if things went right. There was still the possibility of him not being found, and then all his waiting for the killer would be a huge waste of time. He stopped himself. Even if the killer did not come, he would accomplish something substantial with that part of the journey. He would be a new man. He hoped he would still be a man. He stopped himself again. He would believe in it, all of it, including in his own abilities to stay a good person. He was only to be excited about his next plunge into wherever it all took him. He squelched that little whine of worry about what he was to do if the ritual actually worked. Maybe it would be even worse for him if it did not. He shut it all off. Not only would he not just survive, he would win. Not only would the spell work, it would be thrilling to become a stronger, more complete version of what he already was. It was only good. Nothing bad could come of it. It was time to get out of the car. He had arrived. Rob loaded up the suitcase with the supplies he needed that he had gotten at the gas station and the health store. He carried the potted ground ivy in the other arm. He had trudged what felt like a couple of miles through the forest. As the sun had been setting, he had been looking for his camping ground. He had no tent, and he was leaving the shelter of the car behind. He would use some of his clothes as a pillow and blanket more of them over him for warmth. He had walked straight into the woods, away from the front of Sue's car. It felt like as good a direction as any. He had found an area that he had liked, near what sounded like a babbling brook, but then he had heard faint voices and caught a whiff of smoke from a campfire. It was no good. He had to be on his own. He also didn't want those people to be in any danger, so he lugged the heavy suitcase and plant further into the forest until he sensed no one around. When he came upon a clearing, he knew he was at the right spot. It was as if the forest had opened up just for him. It was a small clearing, but it was more than big enough for just himself. There was no time to waste. The sun would be below the horizon soon. He gathered up firewood. He just grabbed arbitrary sticks and branches and twigs for kindling. He squirted them with lighter fluid and used the Zippo to ignite it. The bundle burst into flames, instantly lighting up the area with a yellow glow. The heat was intense, and he was no longer worried about freezing to death from exposure in the night. The popping of the burning wood from the forest floor was as welcome as background television chatter. He sat Indian style with the suitcase and potted plant next to him as he began to lay everything out around him. He looked around at the forest and the flickering shadows the fire was casting. It looked like any other kind of forest, except one of those epic-sized broken tree trunks was surrounding half of the clearing. There were shattered limbs and branches and sticks and twigs that were no longer able to be shattered again after having gone through the petrifaction process. Some of them looked like a giant skeletal hands had been turned to stone. He felt a power from the area, coming from the ground up, as if the very land knew what was about to occur and was charging up for it. The energy was slowly crawling upwards like roots that were climbing through him and using his body as fertilizer. He was getting fuel from the roots as well. They were feeding on each other. His body was covered in goosebumps from the sensation. He didn't think he was just imagining it. He was really feeling something from the earth. It felt eerie, but it wasn't sending him over the edge. He felt really alive and awake from it. He set the hunting knife on the ground next to him. Next to that, he set the half-dozen carton of eggs. One had broken and was oozing through the container. Then he got the loaf of wheat bread, the bottle of red wine, the salt container, the tall water bottle, the rubbing alcohol, and the baby oil out. He got the plastic bag from the health food store and took out the package of powdered slippery elm bark and the boxes of foxglove and stinging nettles teas and set them out as well. He looked at all the supplies. Everything seemed to be in order and accounted for. He took Dr. Grazer's shadily acquired book out and opened it to the 4th lesson. He was using the little girl's drawing of the demon as a bookmark for the more informative book instead. He ignored the rituals for summoning and casting out and went to the ritual for activating the dormant demon within. He cross-referenced with the book just to make sure he hadn't forgotten anything. He had forgotten one thing. Something to stir with. He got up and began looking for a stick. There were many crackling in the fire, but there weren't any others in the clearing. He couldn't believe it. He didn't want to go off into the forest to find another one. He thought about breaking one off a tree at the edge of the area. He began walking towards the encircling wall of trees when he tripped and fell hard. He let out a loud oof sound as he landed with his right cheek in the dirt. Some of it got in his mouth and he began spitting it out after he crunched down on a few unsavory grains between his teeth. He looked at what had tripped him. It was one of the giant stony finger bones. That would work. He went back to his place by the fire and resumed his position. It was time for his sleeping cells to get their wake-up call. He read the directions again in the book. He almost had them memorized. He began to follow them carefully. He grabbed the 6 eggs up in both his hands. The broken one was thickly sloshing between his fingers, while the shattered shell was sticking to his palms. He flung them away from him. They splattered on the dirty ground and coated the earth where they lay. He then grabbed handfuls of bread out of its thin plastic bag and began tearing the slices apart and threw them out into the night and onto the ground with the eggs. "With many thanks I give this payment," he said as the book instructed. He took a plastic cup out of its packaging and poured himself a cupful of wine. He mixed in 3 pinches of salt and topped the cup off to the brim with water. "I bless myself and the earth and all beyond," he said before he gulped the salty, watered-down wine until it was gone. Then he got another plastic cup and began mixing the required ingredients. He put in what he guessed was about a cup of rubbing alcohol. He poured in what he guessed was a cup of water. He plucked 2 leaves and a wilted purple flower from the ground ivy and wadded them up by rubbing his palms together. It had to be freshly plucked, so he'd had to bring the whole pot with him. There was still sticky egg yolk on his hands. He wondered if that mattered. Should he be doing it in a more sterile way, he asked himself. The tribal women couldn't have been doing it next to a sink with palm olive soap on it. He shrugged and went on. He dropped the ground ivy into the watery alcohol. He took a handful of the powdered slippery elm bark and let it dustily fall into the mixture. Most of it floated on top, seeming to refuse to get wet. The book said to put in a tablespoon of foxglove tea and stinging nettles. Rob felt comfortable with the nettles being in tea form, since they were grouped together like that. He wondered if they were supposed to go into tea strainers. If they were, it was too bad, because he didn't have any or anything that was even close. He tried to think of something he could use to filter them. He shrugged again and dropped the earthy-smelling tea grindings of both products in. Some settled in, but some was on top of the island of elm bark that was floating in the middle of the cup, slowly spinning defiantly. He shook the cup in a circular motion, but no more of it went into the liquid. The island just spun around more rapidly. Rob sighed while watching it mock him. He grabbed the stony finger and gently stirred with the large petrified stick. Some dry remnant stuck to it, but he bobbed it up and down in the liquid until it all became reluctantly submerged and mixed together. He set down the stone stick and picked up the knife. He took it in his right hand and pressed the blade to his left palm. He hesitated for a moment and then sliced it in the middle from the thumb out to the pinky. He did it quickly. It did not hurt much. He let the slight dripping flow of blood fall into the mixture. It obeyed and went right on into the still-stirring current. He set down the knife and picked the stone stick back up again. He began to draw the symbol into the dirt. It had to be large enough for him to sit inside of it. He started by drawing a circle in a counterclockwise motion. It was more than large enough. He looked at the soft glow of light that still peeked above the horizon from the distant sun. He made a line in the edge of the circle for the westbound direction. He made 3 more lines for the other directions. At the north line, he copied the drawn diagram's lowercase t, with a slant in the cross that angled down on the right. The west got an angular p, the east got an angular m, and the south got an angular lowercase y. He then drew a diamond in the circle, with each point connecting with one of the 4 directional lines. Inside the diamond he drew a spiral. He started in the middle and went counterclockwise until the diamond was full with the spiral. He got fully undressed and set his clothes and shoes and socks and bracelet aside. He knelt in the middle of the circle. The ground poked into his knees. He peeled the bandage off his shoulder, but he left the suture strips on. They were waterproof and were stuck on very well. He would change them later. He reached over and picked up the squeeze bottle of baby oil. He squirted it into his palms. His cut had stopped bleeding, but the oil stung it like hell. He began rubbing the oil all over his naked body. It felt gross to him, especially in his chest hair. He knew exotic dancers and bodybuilders did it all the time, but he wondered if they enjoyed the feeling of suffocating from their clogged pores. Most of the ones he had seen didn't have very good skin. Maybe that was why. He rubbed it all over, even in his head hair and on the bottoms of his feet, which he had to stand back up to do. Dirt instantly stuck to them. Gross was the only word that would come to mind. He felt so far away from a shower. He was sitting very close to the fire, and his skin was aglow from the reflective quality. He then began to wonder if the oil made him flammable. It certainly was making him feel hotter. He was glad he didn't have to touch the book, since it was open to the right page. His oily fingers would ruin it for sure. Maybe he could rub his hands dry on tree bark later. He looked down at the chant. It was not in English. He didn't know what language it was, or what it meant, but it was written in Old English calligraphy. He wanted to practice it before, but he did not want to say anything dangerous until it was time. He didn't want to invoke anything before he was ready, and he didn't want the words to lose their power. The time had come at last. He spoke and pronounced them the best he could. The words were, Kinna, Yakar, Sinna, Kinna, Havat, Kunusta, Efla, Bagva, Svefin, Gefa, Japhnan, Alar, Samir, Vakti, Lifa. Rob spoke the words with all of his respect, even if he was mispronouncing them. He figured the feeling was more important than the technicality. His arms were out before him, palms up in a welcoming gesture. He said the words 3 times as the book directed. Then he immediately grabbed the cup containing the mixture and chugged it with no hesitation. The taste was even more disgusting than the feeling of being covered in oil, but he had the momentum and the energy and felt his body almost do it without his brain instructing his hands to pick up the cup and bring it to his lips. He swallowed all of it without grimacing or gagging. He was barely aware he was even doing the final act of the ritual. The taste left in Rob's mouth was awful. His esophagus burned. He could feel the shape of his stomach coated in the nasty mixture. He took deep breaths. He did not want to throw up. If he threw it back up, it might all be for nothing. He had enough to do it again, but he did not want to. He wanted it to work properly the first time. He sucked as much of the taste off his tongue as he could. The urge to heave was subsiding. It would stay down. He sighed heavily. He felt exhausted. He took his legs out from under him and sat more comfortably on his hip. His left hand went out to prop him up and support him. He looked up at the stars. There were so many of them. Even by the bright firelight, they shone with such intensity. He hadn't really seen the stars like that since he left Florida. They sure didn't look like that in the city. He took the night air into his lungs. It was refreshing and pure. That was another thing unlike being in the city. The exhaustion was starting to force him to relax. He liked the feeling. He was worried that he felt a little too calm. He asked himself if he really believed in what he just... "Yes, I do!" he yelled up into the night sky. He wasn't just psyching himself up anymore. He felt really good, and that certainly was different for him. That was an amazing mutation already. He laughed to himself at that. He let himself laugh harder and louder. No one was around to hear him. He could just let out whatever he wanted. He felt free. He roared joyously up at the stars. They did not mind. Not at all. He saw his own breath in his inarticulate but very expressive bellowing, but he did not feel cold. Not at all. His yelling left him feeling cleansed when he was done. He felt truly alone and complete. There was no worry that some neighboring camper would hear him. There was no worry. None at all. His stomach began to feel a little funny. It started to feel hot. He took a deep breath to help relax it. It started to cramp up. He winced as it became painful. If he shit everything out onto the ground in explosive diarrhea, that would just be too bad. It would still have to count. He put his fist to his belly and began to laugh. He stopped laughing when the cramping quickly spread through his entire body. Every muscle was tightening and locking up. His other arm came into his belly as well, but he had not instructed it to do so. His legs curled in until he was almost sitting Indian style again. His torso was scrunching until his head was almost in his knees. He was terrified. He was paralyzed. He couldn't blink. His eyes were wide open. Every muscle was rock hard and screaming in pain. He could not scream out loud, though, not that anyone would hear him. He would just die out there alone and huddled in agony. He felt himself become completely dense. As he felt as if he was heavy enough to fall through the earthen floor, he could have sworn he saw the ground go down below him, as if he were slowly floating up, an inch at a time. Just as Rob felt as if he was about to leave his body forever, the wind began to pick up.